In the early 1980s, a young Johnny Depp found himself standing at a crossroads. Music had been his lifeline, the one thing that felt real, the one thing that made sense. But life, as it often does, had other plans. He was barely 20 years old when he packed up what little he had and left Miramar, Florida behind. His destination, Los Angeles, the city of dreams, the city of illusions, the city where millions arrived with hope and left with nothing. Johnny wasn't chasing stardom, he wasn't chasing fame. At that point, all he wanted was to make music, survive, and maybe, just maybe, find his place in a world that never felt like his. The move wasn't glamorous. He had no agents, no auditions lined up. He didn't sleep in fancy hotels. Instead, he crashed on friends' couches, lived out of bags, and scraped together money however he could. One of his first jobs, selling ballpoint pens over the phone. He hated it. The monotony, the cold calls, the rejection, it was soul-crushing. But he stayed. Because something inside him, some small flickering instinct, told him not to leave. Los Angeles was loud, dirty, crowded, but it was also alive. And in that chaos, in that never-sleeping pulse of the city, something was waiting for him, something accidental. Johnny wasn't looking for a way into Hollywood. He wasn't networking, wasn't auditioning, wasn't even particularly interested in acting. But life tends to sneak opportunity in through the side door, especially when you're not paying attention. At the time, Johnny was still struggling, musically, financially, emotionally. His band wasn't taking off the way he'd hoped. The dream of making it in the industry was starting to blur, and he was picking up odd jobs just to survive. That's when it happened. Through his then-wife, Lori Allison, he was introduced to someone who would unknowingly change the course of his life forever, Nicolas Cage. Cage was already making waves in the industry, a rising star with connections, ambition, and an eye for talent, even the kind of talent that didn't know it had any. The two met casually. There was no formal setup, no pressure, just a conversation between two young men in the middle of a chaotic city. Cage saw something in Johnny, a quiet intensity, a different kind of presence, something magnetic, something that didn't scream movie star but whispered possibility. It was Cage who encouraged Johnny to give acting a shot, to try an audition, to step in front of the camera and see what would happen. Johnny, reluctant but open, took the advice. He didn't think much of it at the time. In fact, he often described it as a happy accident. But that accident became the turning point. That introduction, that chance meeting with Nicolas Cage, planted a seed, and soon that seed would grow into the role that changed everything. Johnny Depp's entry into Hollywood wasn't the result of years of acting classes, networking mixers, or stage performances. It didn't follow the rules of the industry, and it certainly didn't fit the traditional narrative of how stars are born. It was, by every definition, an accident, a fluke, a strange twist of fate in a town that rarely offers second chances and barely recognizes the first. When Johnny stepped into the audition room for A Nightmare on Elm Street, he did so with minimal expectations. Acting was never the goal. He still thought of himself as a musician, a guy from Florida who played guitar in smoky bars and wrote lyrics that no one ever heard. Hollywood was a world that belonged to other people, not him. The role he was auditioning for was Glenn Lance, the soft-spoken boy-next-door type, and the boyfriend of the film's heroine. Glenn would ultimately suffer one of the most gruesome deaths in horror cinema, being sucked into a bed only to erupt into a violent fountain of blood. Not exactly a glamorous debut. The director, Wes Craven, was initially unsure. Johnny didn't fit the image of a teen heartthrob in the traditional sense. He was a little awkward, a little quiet, maybe even too rough around the edges. There were more polished, more camera-ready actors vying for the role, but fate had other plans. As the story goes, it wasn't Craven who sealed Johnny's fate. It was Craven's teenage daughter. When shown a group of headshots from potential candidates, she pointed directly at Depp's photo and said without hesitation, "That's him. He's beautiful." Sometimes that's all it takes. And so, with no formal training, no serious resume, and no particular confidence, Johnny Depp was cast in his very first film role. The production itself was modest. A Nightmare on Elm Street was a low-budget horror movie produced by a then little-known studio called New Line Cinema. It didn't seem like a film destined for cult status. No one on set imagined it would launch a franchise, let alone careers. Johnny arrived on set like a stranger who had wandered into the wrong place. He asked questions, he followed directions. He didn't try to stand out, and in doing so, he did exactly that. His performance as Glenn was simple, natural, and real. He didn't play the role like an actor trying to impress. He played it like a person just being. That rawness, that lack of pretense, made his presence on screen hard to ignore. Even in scenes where he said very little, the camera seemed to gravitate toward him. It wasn't just his looks, though those helped. It was something deeper, a calmness, a depth, a sense that this guy was holding something back, and you wanted to know what it was. And then came the scene, Glenn's death. In a nightmare sequence that would go on to become one of horror cinema's most memorable moments, Glenn falls asleep on his bed, headphones on, unaware of the doom approaching from below. Within seconds, the mattress swallows him whole. What follows is a geyser of blood, erupting violently from the bed into the ceiling. It was surreal, terrifying, shocking, and unforgettable. For audiences, that scene was a visual shockwave. For the studio, it was a breakthrough. And for Johnny Depp, whether he realized it at the time or not, it was the beginning of a transformation. After the film's release, A Nightmare on Elm Street became a surprise hit. It launched the Freddy Krueger franchise and saved New Line Cinema from bankruptcy. And tucked within the chaos of its success was Johnny. People started asking, who's that guy? The one with the soft voice and the intense eyes. The one who didn't say much, but who somehow said everything. Johnny had never truly considered a career in acting, but the doors were starting to open and curiosity began to flicker in him. Maybe this strange detour wasn't a mistake. Maybe it was the start of something. He didn't rush into more roles. He still played music, still doubted himself, still resisted the idea of becoming a celebrity. But the seed was planted, the camera liked him, directors noticed him, and slowly, one quiet audition at a time, Johnny Depp began to drift further from music and deeper into a world he never intended to enter. He had stepped through Hollywood's front door, not with a bang, but with a whisper. And from that whisper, the legend would grow. After A Nightmare on Elm Street hit theaters in 1984 and became a sleeper success, Johnny Depp had something he never expected: momentum. People were calling. Casting directors wanted to see more. His name was being whispered in rooms he had never imagined entering. But for Johnny, it was all strange. He didn't feel like an actor. He still felt like a musician who had accidentally wandered into someone else's career. Even after appearing in a hit movie, he wasn't convinced that this world, this business of lights, cameras, and controlled emotions, was meant for him. He once admitted in interviews that he felt like an imposter. Acting wasn't his dream. It wasn't even his plan B. It was a fluke that had somehow taken root. But sometimes the world decides for you. Johnny began picking up small roles. They weren't glamorous and they weren't always fulfilling, but they paid the bills. In 1985, he took a part in Private Resort, a teen comedy that leaned heavily on physical humor and cliché characters. It was far from meaningful, and Johnny hated the experience. He later described it as one of those moments where he felt he was losing control, slipping into the trap of playing pretty boy roles that said nothing and meant even less. He realized something crucial very early in his career. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted to be good. This internal struggle would shape the rest of his journey. Johnny began to distance himself from typical Hollywood paths. He avoided romantic leads. He passed on big-budget opportunities if the characters didn't feel right. What he was looking for, even if he couldn't fully articulate it yet, was meaning, depth, a chance to play people who were broken, strange, misunderstood, characters who didn't fit. Because Johnny never felt like he fit either. At the same time, his presence on screen continued to grow. Directors liked working with him. He listened, he tried things, he was willing to fail, and that made him fearless. And then came a role that would catapult him out of cult status and into the living rooms of millions, the television series 21 Jump Street. He was hesitant. Television in the late 80s was often seen as the lesser medium for actors hoping to make it in film. But the role was steady, the paycheck was real, and at that point Johnny still wasn't sure where he belonged, so he took the leap. In 1987, 21 Jump Street premiered on the newly formed Fox network. The show followed a team of young undercover cops who posed as high school students to investigate crimes. Johnny played Officer Tom Hansen, a clean-cut, morally driven character who slowly became the heart of the show. Audiences loved him. Almost overnight, Johnny Depp became a teen idol. His face was on magazine covers. Teen girls screamed his name. Paparazzi followed him. Fox used his image to build their brand. The actor who never wanted to be famous was now one of the most recognizable young stars in America. And he hated it. He felt trapped, playing the same character, saying the same lines, being pushed into the heartthrob mold he despised. Behind the scenes, he begged producers to let him out of his contract. He didn't want to be anyone's poster boy. He didn't want to sell smiles. He wanted to create, not be packaged. But at the same time, Johnny knew the show gave him something invaluable: leverage, a platform, visibility. And with that, he began to plan his next steps more carefully. He started reading scripts that were different, strange, uncomfortable. He gravitated toward characters who were outsiders, because that's how he saw himself. Misunderstood, unpolished, honest in their flaws. He didn't want roles that screamed leading man. He wanted to disappear into characters, to become someone else, someone raw, messy, and human. Johnny's acting career had officially begun, but unlike so many others chasing fame, he was chasing freedom, and that made him different. The reluctant actor was slowly becoming one of the most intriguing names in Hollywood, not because he followed the rules, but because he refused to. By the late 1980s, Johnny Depp had gone from an anonymous guitar-playing kid to the breakout star of one of America's most watched television shows. 21 Jump Street wasn't just a hit, it was a cultural phenomenon. The series spoke to teenage audiences in a way few shows had before. It was gritty, it was emotional. And at the center of it all was Johnny, playing Officer Tom Hansen, a fresh-faced cop with a good heart and a serious moral compass. But here's the twist. While fans were falling in love with Tom Hansen, Johnny Depp was falling out of love with the very idea of television stardom. Every week, millions of viewers tuned in to watch the young, clean-cut cop crack down on crime in high schools and suburban neighborhoods. Magazine covers declared him the next big thing. America's newest teen idol, the face of a generation. The studio ate it up. But Johnny was suffocating. Because the truth was, he never wanted to be him, the character, the icon, the pinup. He wasn't Tom Hansen, not in real life, not even close. Johnny didn't believe in the neatly packaged narratives that TV demanded. He didn't want to play the hero in a uniform. He didn't want to smile on cue. And most of all, he didn't want to be famous for being someone he wasn't. Behind the scenes, he was restless. He butted heads with producers. He refused to play the pretty boy. He tried, time and time again, to make Hansen more complex, more flawed, more real. But television had rules, and Johnny had always hated rules. So slowly, he began to sabotage the image. He'd show up to set with ideas that deliberately challenged the network's formula. He added quirks to the character, strange pauses, silent intensity, a quiet anger that made Hansen feel like something more than a two-dimensional cop. At times, he'd rewrite lines or shift the energy of a scene. He wasn't trying to ruin the show, but he was trying to reclaim some creative control. Fox, of course, wasn't thrilled, but the audience, they sensed it. That subtle rebellion made Johnny magnetic. He wasn't just acting, he was pushing against the box they tried to put him in, and people couldn't look away. As 21 Jump Street became more popular, Depp's discomfort with fame only deepened. The more they adored him, the more he felt like a product, a brand, a sellable face. He gave interviews reluctantly. He turned down roles that would have skyrocketed his fame even further. He didn't want the attention, and that only made people want him more. By season 4, Johnny had had enough. He reportedly tried everything to get fired from the show. He spoke out publicly about his dissatisfaction. He took on a deliberately bizarre acting style. Eventually, after relentless negotiations, he was released from his contract. It was a huge risk. Walking away from guaranteed success, from a show that had made him a household name. But Johnny knew something that most young stars don't. Fame fades, but integrity, that's forever. Leaving 21 Jump Street wasn't the end of his career. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would choose the projects, the characters, and the direction on his own terms. And with that bold exit, the teen idol was gone. In his place, a rebel, a misfit, an artist, and Hollywood had no idea what was coming next. Johnny Depp never tried to be a rebel. He didn't wake up and think, "Today I'm going to become the outsider." The truth was simpler and more powerful. He was the outsider, and the world just happened to notice. After 21 Jump Street, while most young actors would be milking their teen idol status for all it was worth, Johnny was doing the opposite. He burned his own pedestal. He rejected the Hollywood polish. He skipped red carpets when he could. And when he had to show up, he wore what he wanted: vintage clothes, thrift store jackets, jewelry that told stories instead of following trends. He was unpredictable, honest, messy in a way that made people feel like they were seeing the truth. Fans who fell in love with Tom Hansen began realizing Johnny Depp wasn't just a TV crush, he was different. He spoke in interviews about disillusionment, about art, about not trusting the machine of celebrity. He didn't smile on command. He didn't charm unless he meant it. And that's how the rebel image was born, not from strategy, but from resistance. What made Johnny captivating wasn't just his talent, it was the way he refused to be something he wasn't. The way he challenged expectations without even trying. While other young stars carefully cultivated images, Johnny let his contradictions show. He could be soulful and sarcastic, gentle and dangerous, quiet but intense. He represented a different kind of masculinity, one rooted in vulnerability, mystery, and complexity. Magazines began calling him Hollywood's bad boy, but that was far too simple. Johnny wasn't acting out for attention, he was pushing back for freedom. Every role he turned down, every stereotype he rejected, every artistic risk he took, it all added to this persona, the guy who couldn't be bought, the artist who walked away from safe choices. And when audiences saw that, they didn't just admire it, they felt it. Because everyone deep down wants permission to be themselves. Johnny Depp wasn't trying to give anyone permission, but by being himself so unapologetically he did. And that made him more than just a star, it made him a symbol. The young rebel wasn't a costume, it was just Johnny, unfiltered, and the world couldn't look away.